I'm Teisha Bader. Thank you for joining us as we continue to cover the situation in Israel after the Hamas massacre on October the 7th. We're joined from Jerusalem by Daniel Gordis, Koret Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College. Daniel is the author of 13 books, many of them about Israel, including Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn, which was named Book of the Year in 2016 by the National Jewish Book Award. He also leads the blog and podcast Israel from the Inside. Daniel, thank you so much for being here at this excruciatingly difficult time. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Teisha, for having me. It's an honor.
First and foremost, let me just express our most profound condolences on the unfathomable loss of life that the country has suffered. And we send, of course, our very best wishes for a speedy recovery to the injured and our desperate wish and plea for the swift return of the hostages being held in Gaza. Daniel, you called this attack a pogrom, which is a word I'm sure you, certainly I, never thought we would utter about something happening in our lifetime, but it feels unfortunately appropriate. Can you just talk about what happened? What was your experience on October the 7th?
Sure. And then I'll explain to you why I think, unfortunately, we have to call it a pogrom. There's no other word in the English language. I mean, pogrom isn't actually an English word, but there is no other word in the language that works. So we were at Shul. It was Simchat Torah here in Israel. Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah are on the same day. So we were in Shul. And, we've been davening outside actually ever since COVID started. When COVID started, this group started an outdoor minyan, and it turned out it was lovely. And we go early. It's a 7:30 in the morning davening, but you get out at 9. So it has its, you get the silver lining there. And we were outside and we started to hear these booms, and not really loud, clearly very far away, but there were definitely booms. And, every now and then you hear a rocket getting shot down by Iron Dome, and then it's over, one or two. But this was going on all morning long, and people were starting to get a little like, what is that? Don't forget, this is a community of people who don't use their phones, who don't use radios, who don't use electricity on Shabbat and Chagim. So you're, for all intents and purposes, cut off from the world. It's a mixed neighborhood. So afterwards, we were able to meet lots of people, and we found out more or less what was going on. But at that point, nobody had any idea. And we were all kind of looking at each other. One guy came up to me and said, it must be construction. I said, there's no construction in Israel on Shabbat. And he goes, yeah, well, whatever. Everybody was trying to convince themselves that it wasn't anything bad. But there we were outside in the middle of the davening. We were actually reading Torah, and siren went off. People looked at each other like, really? So everybody started to move into the main building where, when it rains or whatever, is where we go inside. It's a gymnasium right next to the courtyard where we usually gather. And then somebody remembered, actually, oh no, the shelter is not in this building. It's in the other little building across. So people walked in one direction, then they turned around in a different direction. Parents picked up their kids, and we kind of scurried in. And, every now and then there's a false alarm. It goes off sometimes. We didn't really think anything of it. We waited for a few minutes, went back outside. We continued the service. And then the alarm, the siren went off again. And this time people understood, okay, this is not a second mistake, and it's not a second small thing. We went inside, we stayed inside, we finished the service. And then the person who was organizing it said, because it was Simchat Torah, and we're the early service, but they like to be together, the early and the late. They said, okay, but we're going to get together later in a little while when the late service finishes, and we're all going to do the dancing together. And somebody said, no, the late service already disbanded and went home. And that was the moment that I realized, oh, what do they know that we don't know? And we got outside. We started to ask, does anybody know what's going on? People said, yeah, a couple of terrorists got into a kibbutz. Now, that's Israel's nightmare. A couple of terrorists get into a kibbutz. That's the nightmare. Kibbutzim are supposed to be defended against that. But that's the horrible thing. You could take a hostage or two. You could kill some people. I mean, so a chadira, as it's called, which is, breaking the perimeter of the kibbutz, is like everybody's, we said, like, two. And then they said, yeah, but they took the hostage back to Gaza. We're like, how'd they take a hostage back to Gaza? I mean, it really made no sense. But of course, we were completely oblivious. And I have to say, Teisha, that it's right around, it's literally around the corner from my house, this place. And I pass it every morning on the way to a different shul, because I go to a different shul on weekdays. And it feels like a desecrated place. It's just a playground. It's just a big playground with some basketball hoops and God only knows what else. It feels desecrated because now when I go there, I look at it and I say, oh, I was standing right there with my talit and my wife was sitting right over there and it was Simchat Torah, we were singing and they were like, what are those booms? And we didn't know that people were being slaughtered by the hundreds. And, no one wants to be graphic for the sake of being graphic, but just one needs to understand the cruelty of what happened. I mean, babies killed in front of their parents, parents shot in front of their children who were then left alive, people raped in front of their parents or their children, or in one case, as I'm sure you've heard, they actually filmed the rape of an old woman and then shot her in the head and then uploaded it with her own phone to her own Facebook page, which is how her grandchildren found out what happened to her. I mean, who does this? This is not about Palestinian liberation. This is not about ending occupation. This is about seething hatred, an absolute disregard for human life, but even more than that, a kind of orgiastic delight in seeing blood flow. And the rest of the story we know. And so there's no real reason to go over it here. That afternoon, Saturday afternoon, we actually had a friend come over and she recently lost her husband. So she came over by herself and we went in and out of the bomb shelter the whole time. We'd go off, we would go and we'd keep talking, we'd come out with whatever. Since then, we've had our share of Jerusalem has had less than other places, but it's definitely had its share. We've been in the bomb shelter a few times. One thing I'll say about the bomb shelter, which I just think is perhaps interesting for people, there's different kinds of bomb shelters in Israel. What Israel started out with in the 40s and the 50s were like neighborhood shelters. And then there's certain places where you can still see them. There's this like big cement thing that comes out of the ground and a grate. And, everybody knows you pull off the grate and you go in if you have to. But that was all, they were not airtight. That was clear. And they were also, they were neighborhood things. So if you leave something in the neighborhood open up for long enough, you can imagine you get people throw things in there, it doesn't stay clean. It's just not ideal. So that at a certain point in Israel, they started building apartment buildings with a shelter for the building itself. And that way, at least the neighbors keep a closer eye on it. And you don't have to go outside, obviously, to get to the shelter. So you're safer that way and whatever. Then I guess in the 1980s, 70s or 80s, the big threat began to be not little bombs from Egypt or Syria, but people began to worry about gas attacks. That was especially with Saddam Hussein and Iraq and all of that. And then the building codes changed. And it was changed to every house or every apartment. We live in an apartment, but it has one of these things called a mamad, which is an abbreviation, but it means for a residential protected area. And it's huge, thick walls, steel reinforced with a metal door, and the window has a big metal plate, which is so heavy you can't really move it. But in theory, you could move it and slide it across so that shrapnel couldn't come through the window. And it's supposed to be airtight. And it has a lock, not a lock, but you just close the handle and that locks it. And, the door is shut in space. And then you close the window and that's that. The window is an air sealed thing. And it's therefore against the law to drill anything through that wall. But everybody violated it when we moved to Israel because Saddam was gone and nobody was worried about gas anymore. So we put our laundry room in there, so we had to drill in for water, had to drill in for gas because we had a gas dryer at that point and, all that kind of stuff. And we figured, fine. And we've gone in there a few times over the years and, we have our pantry in there and our laundry room in there. So we figure, we'll have clean clothes and food for a very long time. We don't have any mattresses, so we'll be very tired, but what are you going to do? What happened this past week, of course, as we know, is that families went into their mamad. The mamad doors don't have locks because nobody ever thought somebody's going to come into your house and try to get you. This was all about stuff lobbed from far away, from Iraq, from Syria, from God only knows where. Nobody's going to come to your door. I mean, the enemy can't get to your door was the Israeli assumption, but they did. And none of these mamads have locks. And in fact, the home front command had to go on TV often in the days after the original shock and say to people, don't do what we hear people are doing, which is taking the handle off the door. Because the theory is if you go in, you take the handle off, then they can't open it from the outside. They said, yeah, but you can't open it from the inside either. That's very dangerous. Don't do that. Then they started selling at hardware stores things to hold a lot. But the point is, that we're now facing a danger. Even the mamad is itself not sufficient because it's not protected against somebody just right outside the door. And we know that in the kibbutzim around Gaza, which we call the Gaza envelope, they shot through the doors and they tried to move the handle. So you had a lot of families where the husband and wife are trying to hold the handle up and, they're from the outside trying to push the handle down. And it's really, arm wrestling. And if they get it open, there was a story of a wife, a woman on the news just the other day. She said to her husband, if they get the handle down very quickly, shoot us all because we don't want to go where that was going. So but in front of the children, a woman, the children are old enough to understand. She says to the husband, if they get the handle down, shoot us all in the head. What does it mean for a child to have heard their parents say that to their father 50 years from now? I mean, what are they going to... whatever. And then there were cases, by the way, where people were able to keep the handles up. They braced something against it. So they burnt down the house. And it turns out they're pretty airtight, but they're not entirely airtight. And if a gas thing were to come over from Saddam Hussein, it's not that thick. I mean, by the time it dissipates. But if your house burns down, there's smoke everywhere. And they had these special grenades, which they could just lob into a house. And it turns everything into 3,000 degrees. And so the house just crumbles. People wanted to know, but how did the cement burn? These are all cement. 3,000 degrees, almost anything will burn. And families were therefore burnt to death and suffocated to death. They were successful in protecting themselves by not having the mamad door open, whatever. I mean, it's just...
Daniel, it's
where we are on that score.
It's unimaginable. It is truly unimaginable. It is the stuff of nightmares, not beyond what anyone's nightmare was. As you said, the nightmare was a few terrorists get in, not this mass onslaught that we saw. And yet, and Daniel, I know you're born in the US, you've lived in Israel many, many years now, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around this hate that is coming from all sides, it seems, or of chants of Palestine, free Palestine, with people seething with hate against Israel. Having seen what happened, it just, of course, there are people who are protesting for Palestinian rights, etc. But as you said, this is not about that. This was slaughter. This was a pogrom, as you said. Where is the outcry from those people, even if they support Palestinian rights and what have you, against that? As you said, it's an issue. It is a matter of humanity.
Yeah, it's like it's even below humanity. I know it's something even more basic, but you're absolutely right. Look, I mean, from here in Israel, I mean, mostly what we're focusing on is here and keeping ourselves safe. And all of us have kids at the front.
Yeah.
And that's itself terrifying. I have to say, it's terrifying. And I'll say it's a different kind of terrifying because when your kid is 18 or 19 or 20, he's a kid. And therefore, he's not happy to go off to war. But, boys that age have a certain kind of bravado and you worry about him. But when your kid's in his mid-30s and he hasn't been training like he was training back then all the time, and he's been out of the army for 7 or 8 years, and he's got a wife and he's got 2 children, including a newborn, that's a different kind of terror. And it's, by the way, a different kind of terror for them. They know, I don't want to sound cavalier, God forbid, but they know if they go into battle, it's going to sound terrible what I'm about to say, but I think you understand what I mean. If they go into battle at the age of 18 or 19, parents and siblings are devastated. Lives are ruined, whatever. But there's no orphans, and there's no widows, and there's no widows who have to raise kids. And, we made Aliyah 25 years ago because we didn't have, my parents came eventually, but they weren't here then. And we didn't have a lot of family here. So people's friends become their family. I mean, friendships here are tight. And so we've been to all of these kids' bar mitzvahs, but we've also been to their weddings, and we've been to the brises and the simchat bats of their children now. And those people who are now fathers and mothers and husbands and wives are off at the front. It's a kind of terror that I can't really describe. We visited our daughter-in-law and two grandchildren yesterday to help out because there's obviously no school, and she's not going anywhere, and she's staying with the kids because you have to keep in the shelter, out of the shelter, in the shelter, out of the shelter. So we go a few days a week. Her father's also there, so he helps out a few days a week. When I was holding my newborn granddaughter, I guess she's about 2 months old, and this tiny little thing, I'm thinking, when she was born, her father's major concern was this company that he's building, and like every Israeli male, he's going to start up, and what's going to be with it? And he's back in uniform, and he's carrying a weapon, and he's off both training and serving. And this little thing, she deserves to have him back. And so it's pretty heartbreaking here, I have to say, at this particular time. It's an agonizing time to be here. And if I could just make one other comment about, I think, what makes it agonizing is,
Please.
There is a way in which, countries are based on a social contract. I mean, if we all remember Political Science 101 from way, way, way back when, why did people leave the state of nature and join together? For protection. That's why they did it. They didn't do it for the symphony, and they didn't do it because they wanted to have stamps, and they didn't do it because they wanted to have community centers. They wanted not to die. And that's why people got together in the earliest, most primitive human societies to build organizations, states, cities, whatever nowadays, countries, and so forth. And Israel was created to be the place where Jews would be safe. And even if, God forbid, there were wars, and to be sure, there's been a heavy price, but Jews have never been slaughtered here. And when a lot of Jews died, they died on the front. That doesn't make the death any less horrible, but they died in uniform and they died on the front. And as I pointed out in one of the pieces that I wrote, Yom Kippur was by far the most horrible loss of life that we had militarily, but 0 civilians killed, to my knowledge. Maybe there was 1 or 2, but no historian that I've spoken to this last couple of weeks is aware of a single incident where civilians were killed. Not true in 48. That's a different story altogether. But in 56, 67, 73, none. And we started out with 100, with 1,200. Now it looks like more like 300, 1,300 dead civilians. And what that means is, in a certain way, the fundamental idea of what's the purpose of this country has been called into question by people. And I want to stay completely away from politics, and I'll even stay away from the question of how well the government is or isn't functioning. There's lots to say there, but it's not the issue right at the moment. For citizens here, rattling around in their head is, I know why we created this country, and it just proved it can't do it. And that is in and of itself a shock to the system and a kind of blow to the gut, that even if you're safe and your children, God willing, come home, and this thing hopefully ends not too long from now, and we start to rebuild and we start to heal the people that are healed, and God only knows what's being done to the people in captivity and what's going to have to be done to help them for the rest of their lives. And aside from all of that, we have to rebuild a sense of why we're here, because the idea was we needed a place on earth where this couldn't happen. We have the place, and it did happen. So there's going to be a tremendous amount of soul searching about Zionism itself. Forget government and this office and that minister, all of that, of course. But Zionism, I think, is about to go through a profound rethinking.
I hear from a lot of people there that, just repeating this sentence, this country will never be the same.
Yeah. The country is never going to be the same. I mean, for so many reasons. The notion that, the IDF makes mistakes, but fundamentally it's impregnable. Well, you can forget that. The notion that we have, perhaps one of the most elite intelligence systems in the world, that's out the window. The notion that the government, even in times of need, what's saving the day here are civilians and all these civilian command centers. And it's a whole other story, which we won't get to right now. But the country's never going to be the same. Nobody's ever going to really feel, ever is a very long time. In my lifetime, to be sure. In my lifetime, even if I live to a ripe old age, nobody here is going to be certain that we're secure. We're always going to be certain that we actually don't know. And that's a huge change for the country. That's a huge change. And, many of these people in captivity now, they're children, they're young people in their teens and 20s. And there are horrible stories about what's being done to the women, what was done to the women. Those people are going to be around this society. They're going to be the new Holocaust survivors. In other words, now you see these old people with, a number on their arm, and there's relatively few of them left. So the Holocaust takes less and less and less and less. Now the new agonizing shadow of this society is going to be those people. And by the way, what every prime minister, left, right, religious center, it makes no difference, gets up and says on Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, has always been, if the country had been here, this could not have happened. I'm going to be very interested to see if anybody says that this coming Yom HaShoah. Because if you say it, you've got to tweak it pretty dramatically, because otherwise everybody's going to thinking, what are you not remembering? So everything, memory and victimhood, and what does victory look like, and what does security look like, and what does it mean to be reminded that the world, I know this is going to sound overwrought, but I mean this with every fiber of my being. The world hates the Jews. It just does. And don't point to your 5 Protestant friends who live in suburbia who are very nice people. Yeah, I get that. But, on American college campuses in the 1930s and the 1940s, there were no protests to try to save the Jews because they just didn't care. They knew what was happening. Deborah Lipstadt in her book proved that. But now on college campuses, you have people protesting against Israel. You have professors at Cornell saying they're exhilarated by what happened. He's not Palestinian. He's not. There's a hatred for the Jew. We saw it in the Black Lives Matter thing. Remember back in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. What did we have to do with that? What was that all about? How did we end up in that conversation? A guy is angry about immigration, so he kills Jews at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. So people say, okay, a nut job. But it's not just a nut job. The vile, venomous conversation on American college campuses is beyond imagination. And what these people did, and by the way, it was not only Hamas, that's very important to say. It's also important to say that there are, of course, decent human beings on the other side. Of course there are. But as the Hamas trained people were coming across the border, they said to all the little civilians who are running around saying, if you want to come in, come on in. And, teenagers and young men in their 20s in jeans and shirts and, not armed, whatever, but they ran in and they stole and they murdered and they raped just people off the street. They weren't trained. They weren't indoctrinated. They weren't.
In Gaza, you're saying they just called for
as the Hamas militants, terrorists, barbarians, call them whatever the right word is, were pouring across the border. People started to gather around and say, what's going on here? And they said, come on and join us. And they came in with jeeps. They came in with motorcycles. They came in on hang gliders. They tried to come in through boats. They brought food. They brought blood. They brought blood and plasma with them to be able to take care of their own wounded, because they were planning to they planned to take over a large part of the strip. And by the way, we're having this conversation almost 2 weeks after the war began. Yesterday, they found another one alive. So he's been around in the south there for 10 days. Now he's actually obviously hiding, trying not to get killed. They got him. But how many more are there? We actually have no idea. How many more are there? They just have one submachine gun left, and they're eating whatever they brought with them, and they're drinking water, whatever they're getting, and they're just waiting for the right moment. Or are they moving around the country? Are they moving away from the south more towards, I don't know, Jerusalem? Or are they, they look like any Jew. They could, get a fresh pair of clothes and walk along the street. It's just really very hard to know that this is over, even inside. So Israelis are living with an enormous amount of uncertainty and fear, in addition to anger and grief. And I think we're still, we're not quite 2 weeks in yet. I think it's so early in the process to say what we're feeling. I don't even think we know what we're feeling, much less what we're going to do about it, even less what this country is going to look like. But what we have seen is that I think we were surprised by 2 things. We were surprised by how much people out there really hate us. And we were reminded once again of how much people here really love each other. And this country was very divided for most of 2023, divided in a dangerous and a painful way. And I had my own views, which were no secret, and whatever. But those people on all the different sides are now working in these command centers together. And I posted on my blog, as from the inside yesterday, a picture of Haredi men tying tzitzit in army green. So the soldiers who want tzitzit. That's not the Haredi usual attitude to the army. It's like, keep that army away from us. And there's all sorts of things happening. If we get the right leadership, I don't know who that person is, but a person who can really inspire and rebuild. I mean, the next David Ben Gurion, basically, because the country has to be rebuilt. If we get the right person or people, woman or man, in those jobs, we could be on the cusp of something really extraordinary, built out just like last time, built out of the grief and built out of the ashes. Here too, built out of the grief and built out of the literal ashes in some of those kibbutzim. There's a tremendous amount of love and raw material of shared destiny to build something great with. And then we all have to hope and pray that we are up to that challenge, that we build a state that is worthy of the young children who are witnessing this happen.
Amen, Daniel. And I hope, despite all the hate that we're seeing in the world, I hope you feel all the support from us here, because we stand with you. And, somebody posted something saying, "Oh, do you know anyone in Israel?" And the guy responded, "Yeah, a few million of my brothers and sisters." And honestly, that's how we feel. I mean, I can speak for myself and the people that I'm in touch with. We're just sending the hugest embrace to all of you at this time, which none of us could imagine.
We feel it very much, and we are really deeply touched by it, and we're profoundly grateful for it.
Just go forward day by day, one day at a time, as you said, and building this, whatever comes next, with unity, with love. And we certainly hope for better days ahead.
Amen.
Daniel Gordis joining us from Jerusalem. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.